Thank you. I will start as soon as my slideshow comes up on the other screen. Hello, show up on the other screen, please. Thank you. There it is. All right. Let's see. I believe I had this slide up last week. So we'll just kind of do a little bit of overlap and start from there. All right, we're talking about the vision, what we ought to do policy-wise to have a high-performing school system, and we were talking about eliminating the discrimination against private school users. In other words, funding them equally to those who think that a publicly provided, a government-provided schooling option will work better for them. And so one of the parts of the vision is to make that subsidy availability universal. In other words, we're not going to means test or failed schools test or special needs test or have any other eligibility criteria for whether someone can opt out of an assigned public school with any less money than they get if they stay there. All right, so again, we did this last time, so just to kind of get started, there aren't that many really rich people to where it wouldn't make that much difference for them to be subsidized equally to everybody else. So justice is the first reason. And then there's programs for the poor become poor programs. You might enter that in Google sometime and trace the history of that. But the way that I came across that phrase was from reading something from Milton Friedman, where he encountered that in a debate with the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare in those days. Now it's Health and Human Services. But that was cited as a reason to make a program universal, because the politics of programs for the poor invariably cause those programs to be neglected, because the poor are not very well represented by lobbyists and don't even vote at a very high rate. So programs that are targeted for the poor tend to be politically neglected programs. So it's important to have them be universal from that perspective, so that they would get the attention that they deserve and function at a high level politically. Another reason not to be selective by any criteria, including means testing, for who is eligible to leave their assigned public school with their subsidy in hand, is the fact that we need all the competition and all the population to provide the basis for specialization as possible. So if we limit it to poor people or those assigned to the worst schools or those who officially have been designated with special needs, we're ultimately going to hurt everybody by reducing product development, reducing entrepreneurship, and reducing competition that improves quality and drives prices down. Okay, so I jumped ahead a little bit on that slide to the content of this one. Certainly there's something to be said for having an escape hatch from the worst possible schools. And certainly there's something to be said for, hey, the special needs, formally designated special needs are outliers. They're not mainstream, and therefore they may be an especially poor fit for an assigned public school. But the notion that our current school system works well for any set of children is flawed, to say the least. And it's just it may work less well for some than others, and it may be less obvious until later in life that it worked less well for some than others. We need to provide choice to everybody, again, to maximize the potential for specialization, to maximize the potential for competition, to maximize the market scope to attract entrepreneurship. You've seen this link at the bottom here several times, and lately I've shown you the Texas version that's just been published that says that even the very best public schools, the ones that are especially good at what they are trying to do, which is what is being measured, still fail to provide a good fit for a lot of children. So we've gone over that several times this semester. That's the reason to have universal access to choice. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to leave their assigned public school. Universal access means the universal potential to choose an alternative and still be subsidized to the same extent as if you choose your assigned public school. Okay, so again, jumping ahead a little bit, covered that first bullet already. The second bullet, special needs is too narrowly defined. Yes, we have the Individual with Disabilities Education Act. That's the formal basis for designated somebody as special needs, but really all children are special in the sense that they learn differently, they're engaged in different ways by different pedagogies, by different thematics. Repeatedly, I've mentioned that sports theme is a way to engage a significant, but not nearly all children, fraction of the total. So special needs is really much broader than the way we've defined it in various ways in the current school system. Again, another reason not to have targeting criteria for the access to the subsidy. Now, does that mean that every single child needs to be subsidized the exact dollar amount? Something to be said for that. It's pure, it's simple, it minimizes political gamesmanship. But I think over time we can allow the market to indicate that some kids are going to be more costly to educate than others and adjust the subsidy accordingly. We might want to start off the system that way, at least to some extent, and minimize the adjustments because, for example, if you decide that older kids need a larger subsidy than younger kids do, it may be difficult to do that if it means reducing the subsidy for the younger kids as part of the way to make the money possible, make larger amount of money available for the older kids. But certainly it's probably already relatively well established that teaching basic skills to young children costs less per child than schooling older children and the kinds of things that they need to know and that they want to learn. Possibly another way to make the system work better and more politically feasible at the front end is to do something that's already called weighted student formula, and it's already in widespread use around the country. Basically, it means that the powers that be try to figure out how much more certain categories of children cost than others. It may be a good starting point for differentiating the amount spent on some children versus others, but it's by no means a substitute for parents still being able to add on, top off, shared financing, all those synonyms we've been using all semester long. It may make sense to have a larger subsidy for some categories of children than others, but we still need to allow the parents the freedom to top off their subsidy with some of their own money or money from a third party. We need that first and foremost because we don't want to have a price control situation. We don't want the government to be literally specifying what something has to cost and that it can't cost any more than something, or, and perhaps almost as bad, that it can't cost any less than something. We'll get to a little bit more of the price floor, price ceiling thing a little bit later on. The weighted student formula is something that already exists, and we can keep it, and we can make that the starting point for subsidies varying by some types of children than others. But we still need to have room for shared financing for the price decontrol or avoiding price control, and also for the parents to have some skin in the game. We know that people respect things much more when they're not totally free than when they are. All right, so what are the literal ways that we can actually provide these funds to those who want to opt out of their assigned public school? The simplest way, and the one that's in widespread use in other countries, is simply to discover where the children are enrolled, and the government sends a check there, the direct payment method. That may not work here for constitutional reasons. It's got to be indirect. I don't want to get into the legalisms of it, but there isn't all that much difference between a direct payment to a chosen school and, for example, the fourth item on the list, a pure universal tuition voucher. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, so number 2 on our list is refundable tuition tax credit. And the later slides get into a little bit more detail, but let me just mention here at the outset that what exactly that means. It means that if you spend more on schooling your kids than the amount of tax that you owe, then you get a check. Okay, so for example, if you owe $2,000 worth of state income tax, and we have a state-based refundable tuition tax credit system, and you're spending $6,000 on private school tuition, let me just go back to the tax amount, you owe $2,000 in state income tax, well, you're going to get a $4,000 check. Okay, so that's what refundable tuition tax credit means. It sounds a little bit like a voucher, only you pay some up front through your tax liability. The differences are more in the legal system than in the amount of money that changes hand. Now, number two, the refundable tuition tax credits is a little less vulnerable to the price controlling edict that the school may not charge above and beyond the subsidy level, and that's good. The third item on the list, let me wait to the next slide to get into that. It basically just means that you're not going to get back more than the amount that you owe in taxes. The credit's not going to be more than your tax liability. And then pure tuition, universal tuition voucher means in its truly purest sense, which contradicts my previous slide a little bit, namely that you just take the amount of money available for schooling the kids and you divide it by how many kids there are, and that's how much you get if you want to leave your assigned public school. If it's a little less pure, then you do things like I just mentioned, namely a little bit more for older kids than younger kids, perhaps a little bit more for those that are designated special needs in the formal Individual with Disabilities Act sense. Number 5 on our list of possible ways to level the playing field between public and private schools, and in this case, quasi-public, private, chartered public schools would be our 5th item. Unlimited chartering of chartered public school just means make it easy for folks to start a charter school, subjecting them mainly to market accountability, which would require that the price system is there to eliminate shortages and surpluses so that there really is accountability to individuals. Right now, as you know, with the large wait lists, there isn't very much accountability to customers because there are customers standing in the wings. We're waiting eagerly, in fact, to replace anybody that leaves because they're unhappy, making it a little bit, well, actually a lot less important to keep the customers happy and thus be accountable to them. And then the 6th and final one, education savings accounts, which was once deemed far too administratively complicated to implement. As the term implies, it means that you make a deposit in the family account for education use only. The administratively difficult part seemingly is to make sure that they don't use it for anything else other than that which is education related. But Arizona has solved this problem with a coding system, and so it means that you have X dollars that you can spend on your child in any one of many ways: private school tuition, tutoring, other services that are education related. And if there's money left over at the end of your K through 12 period, you're allowed to spend that on your child's higher education. Okay, so here's a brief list of some additional points that I may not have made. First of all, you may want to go to my 2008 articles. The first one, 2008A, explains in somewhat greater detail than what we're doing here the differences between the 12 ways to expand school choice beyond the residential choice that currently exists. That's what school choice expansion means, is to have more of it than we already have. And 2008B is an analysis of what passes for evidence in many cases, and exactly what we have evidence for and we don't have evidence for the performance changing ability of these various ways to subsidize public and private schools equally or more equally. All right, so we already mentioned the refundable tax credit. What that means, it means you may get a check. You probably will get a check because if you have even one child in school, that exceeds the amount that most people owe of any state or local tax, or even a combination of taxes. And then number 3 means that families and businesses can get a tax credit for donating money to a low-income fund, or in the case of families, get a credit simply for taking their children out of the assigned public school and using a private school instead. And then for the money that's donated for the credit, to get the credit, that goes to organizations that administer low-income voucher funds. And so you see that makes up for a big shortcoming of non-refundable credits if there isn't that possibility of donating to low-income voucher funds, because otherwise the credit isn't worth anything to families that don't owe very much in taxes, typically your poor families. So now we have a way to take care of that part of it. The donated money is divvied up among families that are low income to provide them increased access to private schools. Okay, so you can see there's a link to look at there if you're more interested in exactly how that would work. Basically, the bottom line, or one of the key bottom lines out of reading that article and looking at non-refundable tax credits, is you have to apply it to a lot of taxes, state and local, to come up with a large enough sum of money to substantially level the playing field between a free, no tuition charged, assigned public school that's financed by about $13,000 per child per year as a national average, versus how much money you could cobble together to subsidize your child via your various taxes, income taxes and property taxes and sales taxes, if you made the tax credit good against more than one of those at a time. If you just had it available to be a credit against, say, the income tax, there are several states, including Texas, where that wouldn't be relevant at all because there is no income tax against which to have a credit. But even for the states that have an income tax, other than maybe New York and California, for some richer families, the amount of credit wouldn't be large enough to make up for a very large amount of the tuition that's paid. So you need to have a multi-tax basis for non-refundable credits to make those credits very large compared to the tuition that you owe. Number 5 there at the bottom of this slide, we've talked about that several times this semester. If we want to use chartered public schools as the vehicle by which to achieve the school system transformation that I've asserted all semester long that we need and that you may or may not agree with, then we need to have it be possible for parents to top off their subsidies so that charter schools that cost more than the government-funded level can exist to begin with, and to avoid the price control that's devastating in terms of quality and market entry that we would otherwise have, and to avoid the wait lists that we currently have in mass quantity. Number 1, if you recall, that's a direct payment. Number 4, that's the pure universal tuition voucher. Again, just to hammer on this again and again and again, if we want those to perform at a high level, we need to make it possible, even after applying the weighted student formula basis for deciding what amount of money follows a child leaving an assigned public school. Even after that, we need to have it be possible to accept the government funds as partial payment, which means make it possible for families, allow them to top off the subsidy level with their own money or money from a third party. Education savings accounts, since you have to have the flexibility to divide up the money any way you want to support your child's education, those avoid the price ceiling effects automatically, and also they avoid the price floor effects because you can carry the money over from one year to the next, including beyond the K through 12 period on to higher education. The price floor effects, what does that mean exactly? That means that if you have, say, a $5,000 tuition voucher, there's really not any incentive for schools to charge any less than $5,000, even if, or charge any less than whatever the voucher amount is, even if they're providing a pedagogy that costs a lot less than that. We don't want to have price floor effects and waste money and have other negative effects, such as surpluses, any more than we want to have price ceiling effects, although the price ceiling effects are more are more devastating, more damaging than price floor effects. The nice thing about the education savings accounts is the multi-provider and over a multi-time period flexibility that you get. And so that's my preference among all the different options. That's why occasionally when I argue, when I discuss these different things, I say that, look, voucher is the V word, but vouchers are obsolete because refundable tuition tax credits and education savings accounts, especially the education savings accounts, are better. Now, specifics in terms of the payment policy. For better parental oversight and respect and other things, they need to have some skin in the game. So no matter income level, anything, I would argue that if somebody wants to opt out of their free assigned traditional public school, that they need to have some private payment from their own bank account. Some piece of the total needs to come out of their pocket. And likewise, to have price decontrol, to have the price system perform its magic in allocating resources and providing information. That's another reason why it needs to be possible and not necessarily just required for the skin in the game issue. It needs to be possible for parents to top off their subsidy with their own money for shared financing to occur. As we already said, the X dollars can vary with the child age, the weighted student formula, or special needs status, but it cannot vary by school type. In other words, we're not going to argue that, hey, if you go to your assigned public school, you get $10,000, but if you want to go to a private school, you only get $8,000. Now that said, before we divvy up the money and decide that we're going to subsidize equally or nearly equally, we have to take account of the fact that we do have debt to service for our government-provided, government-owned schools, and so we need to take that money off the top, and then from there on, and also money for pensions, and then from there on we can divide it up equally or more or less equally according to the weighted student formula basis. Now, what are some acceptable universal strings to attach to this money? Well, one universal string has to be, for a variety of reasons, utter transparency in terms of what the school does and how it does it. And that's partly that's just to provide accountability to the taxpayer, but it's also there to help families decide which schooling option is the best fit for their child. All businesses are regulated in terms of health and safety issues. Schools should be no difference. And when I use the term discrimination here on this slide, I mean in the traditional gender, ethnicity, race sense. We need to continue to have rules in place that say that you cannot discriminate according to any of those criteria. Also, you can't preach violation of the law, the notion that somebody's going to set up some sort of a terrorist or extremist school. I think this came up in our discussion recently, too. There are other things that you can do. For example, set a relatively low but not near zero school size so that somebody can't open a school for 10 kids to preach violence based on, well, it doesn't matter what it's based on, that they can't preach violation of the law. And then the last one on this slide, the traditional public schools are owned lock, stock, and barrel, staffed by government employees, so certainly this political process has got to decide what the practices of those schools are. But in terms of universal strings, it's not going to decide the practices of the alternatives to the traditional public schools. Yes, there might be a little bit of regulation in terms of content to make sure that everybody learns certain minimal, non-controversial things. Right? If we do it more than minimally, we end up in the State Board of Education fiascos where we're going to try to decide in detail what all the textbooks contain and what curricula should contain. We know from Ahrens and McCluskey, look those up in your bibliography, that it's very difficult to provide any kind of a detailed accounting of what should be difficult politically to agree on what all children should learn. But at least in some relatively non-detailed sense, we might want to have some regulation on content to provide the public values of schooling. All right, so this is our last slide of Module 7. And so this is just sort of a bridge to our Module 8, which is, okay, so what should we expect from this vision? Yes, Dr. Merrifield, you said we should expect a dramatically better school system. What will it look like? Will there be more schools or less schools? What sorts of things can we expect from it? Are they all good, or are some of them bad, and we'll have to swallow those to have the good effects? Well, stay tuned. We'll get into that in November, but here's just sort of a hint. One of the things we can expect by leveling the playing field between public and private schools and not have it be means tested or special needs tested or failed schools tested is a dynamic, diverse menu of competing schooling options, which would include, because some kids learn better in front of a computer than others, and some of them will depends on which subject it is, so we would have virtual schooling and blended schooling between machines and people. We would have a dynamic, diverse menu of competing schooling options. Dynamic in what sense? The price system and parents' changing tastes and preferences will dictate which schools survive and for how long, and which ones grow and which ones shrink over time, just like the businesses in the rest of the economy. And diverse in what sense? Well, diverse in what they teach, specifically how they teach it. Diverse in terms of technology and subject theme. There's that sports theme school again as an example of what that could mean. And diverse in price range. We would like to have our subsidy be such that a lot of schooling options are free or close to free, not free. Well, certainly the traditional public schooling option is going to stay free because, well, for example, constitutionally, in Texas and other states, it requires the state to maintain a system of free public schools. Well, fine. That doesn't mean that they can support only those schools. But the non-traditional public school options, the rest of the system, is going to be diverse in terms of price, because doing different things costs a different amount of money typically. And so we want the subsidy to cover most of that, but not all of it, to provide that skin in the game, and the prices are going to adjust to market forces. That provides that critical signaling mechanism to both the consumers and potential and actual producers of schooling options. So, somewhat abruptly, that's it. We're done with Module 7, and we'll move on to Module 8 in November. Goodbye.